Greetings and welcome. Today we're turning to the second part of Timothy Snyder's excellent history of the Holocaust and the mass killings of World War II era and his wonderful historical treatment in Black Earth. The context for much of the tragedy which Timothy Snyder describes in this book is the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany, in the operation which it named Barbarossa, Germany had the idea that it would quickly, through blitzkrieg warfare, quickly overwhelm the Soviet Union. It would march on Moscow, and it would have the same kind of rapid victory which it had had against France and against Poland. But in fact, by December of 1941, and by the way, the invasion began only in August or so of 1941, but by December, it was quite clear that this military strategy was a complete failure. Winter came in November, and even some of Hitler's generals were somewhat sarcastic about this, saying, is it a surprise to Hitler that winter comes in November in Russia? The roads became impassable, supply lines grew long, and the Soviet armies, seemingly inexhaustible, continued to gather in reserve. It became clear within 6 months into 1942 that the war aims which Hitler had against the Soviet Union, his searching for Lebensraum, was simply not attainable. And the Wehrmacht never reached Moscow. But the annihilation campaign against the Jews of Eastern Europe proceeded at a lightning pace. Snyder has a very powerful and a very original thesis in his explanation of the rapid and horrific killing which occurred from 1941 and really for the remainder of the war, but most intensely 1941, 1942. His thesis is that the Holocaust and the annihilation of eventually 6 million Jews resulted most importantly from the destruction of state institutions in the countries that were occupied first by the USSR and then by Nazi Germany. We tend to think of anti-Semitism as being the cause of the Holocaust, but Snyder makes it very clear that anti-Semitism is a part of the motivation of the campaign, but it is not at all an explanation of the success of the campaign against the Jews. Hitler's ability to carry out his plans of mass murder depended instead on the smashing of the states and the institutions of the countries which the German army attacked in Central and Eastern Europe. Why were state institutions so important to the success of a campaign of mass killing? It's not because the states of Eastern and Central Europe were liberal states, that they were consistently concerned about the rights of persecuted minorities. Rather, it's because states in their nature establish systems of law, systems of individual rights, and crucially, the institutional definition of citizenship. Furthermore, states establish institutions, bureaucracies, and judicial procedures that preserve those rights of citizenship. The experience of the attempt in Germany to remove the citizenship rights from its own very small Jewish population, about 1% of the German population was Jewish, the relative failure of that process was illustrative. It took 5 years to expropriate Germany's Jews. But in Ukraine, in the Baltic countries, and in occupied Poland, the expropriation and eventually the destruction of Europe's Jews occurred at a lightning pace. But a point which Snyder makes very powerfully as an historian and as a political analyst is that both the Nazi state and the Soviet state sought to create complete and absolute political dominion in the territories that they controlled. And this meant a ruthless killing of the political elites in these countries, Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, etc. It meant destroying the civic and political institutions of those states. And both the Nazi apparatus and the Soviet murder machines were entirely ruthless in killing the potential sources of political opposition in the years to come. There were mass killings of civil servants, mayors, governors, judges, and politically engaged citizens in all of these countries. And then there was a major effort, first by the Soviets to find collaborators, and then even more importantly, the Nazis to find collaborators who had perhaps resisted the Soviets and then became full, completely committed collaborators with the Nazis. Here's a quote about state smashing, which I think is an important one to emphasize. The state stood at the middle of the story of those who wished to kill Jews and of those who wished to save them. Its mutation within Germany after Hitler's rise to power in 1933, and then its destruction in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland in 1938 and 39, transformed Jews from citizens into objects of exploitation. The double assault upon state institutions in the Baltic states and Eastern Poland, first by the Soviet Union in 1939 and 40, and then by Nazi Germany in 1941, created the special field of experimentation where ideas of a final solution became the practice of mass murder. So for Snyder, the idea of the smashing of these institutions of state power, legitimate government in country after country, this was absolutely essential to the program of mass murder and mass genocide. Snyder believes that the case of Denmark is a very powerful confirmation of that idea. Denmark was not all that different from the Baltic countries, so it was separated from the landmass of Europe by, at least in part, by water. But Denmark was occupied by the Germans, but its state was not smashed. Its state did endure essentially throughout the course of the war. And the survival of those political institutions in Denmark prevented the extermination of Denmark's Jews. That story is sometimes told as the heroic efforts to defend by the people of Denmark. But I think Snyder's view is that, yes, of course, there were heroic individuals who helped Jews to escape from Nazi murder. But more important than that was the fact that there were legal protections, there were passports, there were rights of citizenship. When Rudolf Mildner, who was the head of the Gestapo in Denmark, when he began the program of trying to round up and exterminate the Jews of Copenhagen and Denmark, he was confronted with institutions, now I'm quoting, that had been abolished further east in the Baltic countries: a sovereign state, political parties with convictions and support, local civil society in various forms, a police force that could not be expected to cooperate. Remember how that contrasts with the state of the Ukraine, where Ukrainian police and militias were all too ready, all too prepared to join in killing teams and to join in the Holocaust against the Jews of Ukraine and the Jews of Poland. Quoting, "The Jews who were denied state protection in Denmark shared the fate of Jews who lacked state protection in Estonia, or for that matter, everywhere else, death." So he thinks this is the distinguishing characteristic of Denmark, the survival of state institutions, which gave the Jews of Denmark an institutional basis for survival. Quoting, "The history of each country that retained some measure of sovereignty despite German influence was, of course, distinct. Each country was different, but the logics of survival everywhere were the same: citizenship, bureaucracy, and foreign policy." And a little further on citizenship, citizenship in modern states means access to bureaucracy. Bureaucracy has the reputation of killing Jews. That's what we think of when we think of Eichmann. It would be closer to the truth to say that it was the removal of bureaucracy that killed Jews. So long as state sovereignty persisted, so did the limits and possibilities afforded by bureaucracy. Let's turn now to survival. Not every Jew in Europe was killed, though a very large percentage in some countries, maybe 90, 95% in some countries, were killed, but there were survivors. And they survived through multiple means. In the countries of the Bloodlands, that territory between the Soviet Union and Germany, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, the vast majority of Jews did not survive. I find the photography, which was done by a Jewish photographer, Roman Vishniak, between the wars. The book is called A Vanished World, and this photograph is one instance. And I choose this photograph because it's an instance of happy childhood, happy family life in Jewish communities between the wars. And of course, all of those communities were massacred. There were efforts to rescue Jews from mass murder. There were diplomats. Raoul Wallenberg is probably the best known in the United States, and especially in Michigan, because he studied for at least a year at the University of Michigan. I believe he studied architecture. And so there is a Wallenberg Prize at the University of Michigan. But diplomats for Japan, China, Spain, Poland were more than willing to extend themselves, sometimes at risk to themselves, simply sometimes as an exertion of effort at providing some support for the Jews who were isolated and on the run. Diplomats were able to provide exit visas, travel permits, and in that way were able to save what amounted to thousands of Jews in their effort to emigrate to other countries. Furthermore, a small number of non-Jewish neighbors in some of these countries gave support and shelter to Jewish men, women, and children. But Snyder makes it very explicit. This was a small number. Quoting from Snyder, the Christians who showed mercy to Jews, such as Rufeisen, were exceptions in the moral catastrophe that was Christianity during the Holocaust. In a time of inundation, they worked quietly against the current, surfacing to help and then disappearing. And one of the things I really like about this book is Snyder tries to give us some detailed examples of individual people, individual families, either who contributed to the survival of some of their Jewish neighbors or sometimes betrayed them and led them to their death. This is a very poignant passage. I'll read the passage. Ita Straz, a young woman of 19, was pulled by Lithuanian policemen to a long pit in the Ponari forest. She had heard the firing of the guns and now could see the rows of corpses. This is the end, she thought. And what have I seen of life? She stood with others, naked at the edge of the trench as the bullets flew past her head and body. She fell straight backward, not feigning death, simply from fright. She remained motionless as one body after another fell on top of her. When the pit was full, someone walked on top of the final layer of corpses, firing downward into the heap. A bullet passed through Ita's hand, but she made no sound. Earth was thrown over the pit. She waited for as long as she could, then pushed her way through the bodies and dug through the soil. Without clothing, covered only in mud and the blood of herself and others, she sought help. She visited one cottage and was turned away, and then a second, and then a third. In the fourth cottage, she found help, and she survived. It's a very poignant story, one out of many hundreds of people who were killed on that same day. There was also armed resistance, and especially armed resistance in Poland. There was both the Warsaw Uprising, which was patriotic Poles and Jews, and there was also the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which both of which were eventually completely crushed, but they showed a willingness to fight the Nazis, which is quite heroic. Quoting, "The Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 was the most significant urban rebellion against German rule. Although it was organized and fought in the main by the Polish Home Army, it was perhaps the largest single effort of Jewish armed resistance. In all likelihood, more Jews fought in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 than in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, and some fought in both." And this is a photograph of the Warsaw Uprising. Let's turn now to truth and lies, because this is a really important part of the story we're going to be turning to next week. History as a true telling of the story, and history as mythologizing, self-justification, and an effort to strategically secure advantage for the future. And here I'd like to focus on Soviet lies and propaganda. And it is just appalling to realize the crimes that were committed by Stalinism from the early 1930s all the way through the 1960s. Two quotes I think are worth reading. The actual facts of the matter, who had fought against whom, who had collaborated with whom between 1939 and 1945, were largely irrelevant. History was not to be discovered and understood, but to be worked into a shape that was suitable for the future of the Soviet political order. In other words, history was to be cut to shape to the intentions of Stalinism. All governments do this in some measure. The Soviet aspiration was unusual because it was total. Amplifying that point, Polish soldiers who had spent the whole war fighting the Germans were classified as fascists and sometimes even executed along with German prisoners. Meanwhile, Poles who had tortured and murdered Jews during the war joined the Polish Communist Party, which was reestablished under Soviet tutelage and became supporters of the new Soviet-backed communist regime in Poland. Polish history is incredibly interesting. I mentioned Janina Bauman last week, I think, a little bit of quote from her memoir from the Warsaw Ghetto. And her husband is a very prominent sociologist, Polish sociologist. His biography is truly fascinating and worth reading. And if you're interested in the history of social science within the context of war, genocide, communism, Nazi doctrine, it's a fascinating story. Continuing the lies that were told by the Soviets, thus individual Poles who resisted the Germans and resisted Soviets and drew attention to the special Jewish plight were a hindrance to memory policy. Witold Pilecki, who volunteered for Auschwitz and fought in the Warsaw Uprising, was shot by the Polish communist regime as a spy. Władysław Bartoszewski had been sentenced to Auschwitz by the Germans and who had worked ably to rescue Jews in Zagota, was sentenced to prison by the communists for his service in the Home Army. So that's the lies which were told by the Soviet Union after its occupation, first of Eastern Poland and then the mastery of all of Poland by the Red Army and the establishment of a Stalinist, socialist, collectivized state. So let's turn now to another point, which I think is very important in the book, but it's Snyder's concern about the role that Auschwitz plays in contemporary memory. Because Snyder believes that post-World War II politicians and historians and the public have misunderstood the Holocaust by telling the story of Auschwitz in a way which is very misleading. This is not Holocaust denial. This is rather to understand what role Auschwitz did play and how that role compared to the shooting pits of Ukraine and Poland and the Baltic countries. We have seen that the majority of killing did not occur in death camps or in Auschwitz, but in killing pits all over Eastern Europe, from Mariupol to Kiev. Millions of Jews were killed by gunfire by German SS units, military units, police order units, and collaborator police and militia units in Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, and occupied USSR. In other words, the picture of the Holocaust that it is emblemized by the death camp and labor camp at Auschwitz is to badly misunderstand the nature of the atrocity which occurred in 1941 through 1944. Quoting from, these are three short quotes, Auschwitz has been a relatively manageable symbol for Germany after the Second World War, significantly reducing the actual scale of the evil done. And Auschwitz has also become the standard shorthand for the Holocaust because when treated in a certain mythical and reductive way, it seems to separate the mass murder of Jews from human choices and actions. And he may be thinking here of the idea of the banality of evil and the idea that it was simply a machine. It wasn't any individual's activity. And then the third quote that I think is important, Auschwitz calls to mind mechanized killing, ruthless bureaucracy, or the march of modernity, or even the end point of enlightenment. But Snyder's basic point is the bulk of the Holocaust had nothing to do with these tropes. The killing that occurred in Ukraine and Poland and Belarus and Kiev and all of these places we've been talking about, there was nothing sophisticated, nothing bureaucratic about it. It was groups of men taking rifles and machine guns and directly, personally killing many thousands of people in a given day. So what are some of Timothy Snyder's conclusions? Two quotes here. If we are serious about emulating rescuers, if we're serious, that is, about kind of thinking about what role did the few individuals who tried to make a difference during the Holocaust, if we're serious about that, we should build in advance the structures that make it more likely that we would do so. Rescue in this broad sense thus requires a firm grasp of the ideas that challenged conventional politics and opened the way to an unprecedented crime. We could have some good conversation about that quote. Second important quote here, mass killings generally take place during civil wars or regime change. It was the deliberate policy of Nazi Germany to artificially create conditions of state destruction and then steer the consequences towards Jews. Destroying states without such malign intention produces more conventional disasters. So he's actually going a little beyond the ideas which I mentioned at the beginning of this set of slides, and that is that there's a causal connection between state smashing and Holocaust. What Snyder is saying here is that smashing of state institutions was itself a deliberate instrument leading to broad and relatively easy mass killing. Quoting again, the dominant stereotypes of Nazi Germany is of an all-powerful state that cataloged, repressed, and then exterminated an entire class of its own citizens. This is not how the Nazis achieved the Holocaust, nor how they even thought about it. The enormous majority of the victims of the Holocaust were not German citizens. Jews who were German citizens were much more likely to survive than Jews who were citizens of states that the Germans destroyed. The Holocaust is from the bloodlands more than it is from Germany or even Austria, though the Anschluss led to a terrible set of tragedies to the Jews of Austria. So here's the heart of Snyder's view, his kind of theoretical view, his historical causation view. On the one hand, social scientists have shown that ethnic cleansing and genocide tend to follow state collapse, regime change, and civil war. On the other hand, historians emphasize that certain kinds of polities, Communist Party states such as the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, are capable in times of peace of killing large numbers of their own citizens as a matter of deliberate policy. It's not exactly a paradox, but it's showing that mass killing can emerge actually from multiple pathways. This is, I believe, the last several sentences of the book, and I think they're powerful, powerful sentences and very relevant to the questions which we're raising here in the seminar. Understanding the Holocaust is our chance, perhaps our last one, to preserve humanity. That is not enough for its victims. No accumulation of good, no matter how vast, undoes an evil. No rescue of the future, no matter how successful, undoes a murder in the past. Perhaps it is true that to save one life is to save the world, but the converse is not true. Saving the world does not restore a single lost life. The family tree of that boy in Vienna, like that of all the Jewish children, born and unborn, has been sheared at the roots. And some poetry. I, the root, was once to flower. Under these dim tons, my bower, comes the shearing of the thread, death saw wailing overhead. The evil that was done to the Jews, to each Jewish child, woman, and man, cannot be undone, yet it can be recorded and it can be understood. Indeed, it must be understood so that its like can be prevented in the future. That must be enough for us and for those who, let us hope, shall follow. This is a passage I'd like to discuss Tuesday when we talk about Snyder, because there are many important ideas here which I think are very relevant to the question of confronting evil in history.